boom. And there we are. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Vagabond Dog Industry Chats. This week, we have a guest by the name of Benjamin Rivers, notorious indie game dev.
Oh,
Well, I mean, no, I guess.
well,
Notorious will fit. It'll fit. You've been at it for a good long time. I think first game I know you from is 2012, so we're coming up on 10 years now. For those of you who aren't familiar, Ben has made games. I guess they're all. I mean, I don't want to say they're all horror-y themed, but they have a little bit of horror in all of them.
right.
You have Home, which is probably the game I first know you from. Then there was Alone with You, which I think I played on the Vita, if I'm not mistaken. And then your most recent title is Worse Than Death. And yeah, I'll try and give you an idea of these games. They're very focused narrative, slanted adventure games. I guess you want to. What genre do you think they all land in?
That fits. The genre I always have to pick on the storefronts is usually adventure first, so that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. A well defined and evolving art style over this 10-year history of making games. And I guess welcome to the show. I'm sorry for butchering your game description.
No, that's great. I like to hear what other people think of whatever it is we do.
Right.
No, thanks for having me.
No, cool. I guess if you'd like, I mean, feel free to give the elevator pitch on Worse Than Death, at least your newest one.
Sure, yeah. Worse Than Death, man, it came out in 2019. Remember that year?
Time flies, eh?
Oh my god. That game is a horror game. We call it it's a horror game based on a high school reunion that goes terribly wrong, and it's set in 1996. And it follows these two friends who go back to their small town that they grew up in to go to a high school reunion. There's clearly some baggages of things going on between them, and then some terrible shit happens, and then you play this side-scrolling horror game that's sort of like, it's got like Metal Gear Solid 5 style cover mechanics plus adventure game puzzle fiddly bits, evil enemies that chase you, and is really scary. My brother did music for the title screen and stuff.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've noticed, I mean, especially when you're comparing Worse Than Death and Home, is like that similarity in terms of the perspective, the side-scrollingness, and God, there's I don't know how to I'm not a very cinematic person, so it's hard for me to explain it. But you have that like close camera. Oh, I want to call it claustrophobic, a little bit. It keeps it the scenery tight. What do you call? What I mean, how do you describe the visual aesthetic that it in these games?
Yeah, because they're primary, like with both Home and Worse Than Death, the primary visual style is pixel art for the adventure sequences. The difference between Worse Than Death and Home is that for anything that's like an overlay or UI or cutscenes or for puzzle sequences, we did high-res art that was all hand-drawn.
Yes.
To fit that. And that's something we want to do because of the sort of my comic book love, passion, obsession. I wanted to sort of squeeze more of that kind of stuff in there. But the side-scrolling pixel art aspect was very deliberate between the two. In fact, originally Worse Than Death was meant to be like Home 2. I wanted to just try to see what I could do with it, but then I had all this other stuff that came up. I said, "Oh, this is going to take it into a very different direction than what Home was in terms of like the core mechanics. It's a lot more involved and probably a bit more traditional, more action adventure or whatnot." But I was just like, it's just the game I have to make. Like I want to play this game, so I want to make it. But the thing that always gets me about doing pixel art is just I love the interpretation that is required from the player. I love the imagination that is required, and like I can watch a million, AAA trailers with like the highest fidelity graphics, and they just bore me to tears most of the time because you don't get any of that audience engagement. It's like just a beautiful cinematic is cool, but I will play like a Game Boy game today. And kind of just get this entire world out of those tiny pixels and feel like I feel something in my heart, like really invested, really jonesing for what's going on behind the scenes of this sort of pixelated background. And that's why for both those games, and for Alone with You as well, doing pixel art was so important, because when people sort of just pick apart what's going on and have their own interpretations, like that's part of the fun. That's what makes games cool.
Right, right, right. It increases that, I guess, mental investment someone has to make when analyzing a scene or looking at a character, and it does, I guess, fill that imagination space a lot more. The one challenge I've always found when doing pixel art is getting the having the limitation and having a hard time necessarily expressing fine details, or it's like you've got less pixels than you need to communicate a pin pad or something that's got little bits of information on it. How do you approach those sorts of problems when you're doing your art?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I take essentially from comics and somewhat from animation. I don't claim to be an expert in animation, but I have been doing comics for a long time, so it's something I study quite a bit. But you, in the absence of fidelity, you must find communication in other ways, just like you said. So the good thing about games is because you're animating things, oftentimes the animation helps with that. So whether it's an exaggeration of like a character animation or reaction, like a Worse Than Death, they obviously little emotes and stuff, and of course they're sort of cartoony because they have to be bigger than you would normally get. You can't have like a motion captured person who can not tilt their head and you get this deep sense of what they're doing. You have to have arms move and legs move and head moves in wider circles and whatnot. So that's another way that really helps. And of course, having sound and other bits, sound and animation and motion fill in those blanks that just a static, set of pixels can't do. So for Worse Than Death, especially because it's horror and it's meant to be gory and like there's more direct violence than in something like Home. How do you make that not look goofy? And a lot of that is just like color, finding like the right tone, and then making sure to set the mood with sound and music and all that, so that people don't realize that they're getting freaked out or disgusted or whatnot by, like maybe 2,000 pixels on the screen or something.
Right. Hey, so, keeping with a similar aesthetic, I mean, Alone with You is the outlier. I think there's a lot of similarities, like you said, between Worse Than Death and Home. Alone with You, I correct me if I'm wrong, but it's you in your second game, and you're trying a lot of different things artistically with it. But I found that it still carried a lot of the same sort of like presentation technology, right? You definitely go for a more traditional point and click kind of ability to explore the environments, and less focused on the tight side scrolling.
Right.
But you haven't strayed a million miles away from the heart of what people appreciate about your games. Have you found a lot of advantage in retreading some of the technological ground and aesthetic as you've created these?
Yeah, there's certain things where, again, like with making comics, if you're a comic artist, you don't reinvent your tools every single book you make or every single strip you make. It's more about refining and improving from there. And if you find something that reaches a great effect, whether it's like someone who works purely in black and white or traditional versus digital, etc., that's something that you explore and becomes part of how you communicate. So I've never thought. I say this knowing that our next game is very different, but I've never thought like, oh man, if I don't, like artistically at least, if I don't, get more shaders in this game, like I'll never feel like a real game dev. Sales and stuff are a totally different matter, getting attention or press, but in terms of like what I wanted to do, like I actually just kind of like whiteboarded a game concept like an hour ago, and that it's like also very low res and sort of retro in certain ways. And I was like, oh man, I can't wait! Like I got to get this game done. It sounds so sweet. So there's just obviously there's something about that keeps drawing me back. So I'm really into it. The fun thing with the fun thing between going with From Home to Alone with You and Worse Than Death was there's a lot of tools and sort of back end tech that I brought forward from like the quote unquote engines that I'd made. They were, I can't call the original code base for Home an engine because it was just so duct taped together.
Right.
But essentially brought things from one to the other. I'm like, oh, now I can do this, but I can do this better now. So let's just do that plus 20% more.
Mm-hmm.
And then Worse Than Death was like, now I can do all this stuff from Alone With You super easy because I got all that stuff already, but 20% more. And I really find that progression very interesting. And, you know, one of the things was the collaboration of working with another artist on Alone With You was a big thing that we brought to Worse Than Death. So another artist named Gavin McCarthy did all the backgrounds and a bunch of other stuff in Alone With You. I sort of like sketched out, like he basically got like documents that had level sketches and designs and things that he could trace over or like set up files for and interpret and whatnot. And then he did all the final art. He built templates and pieces and set pieces that we could reuse and all that kind of fun stuff. Mm-hmm. And then he started on Worse Than Death to do that, but then he just had other projects he had to do. So I worked with another artist named Nicola Odick, who did all the backgrounds of Worse Than Death and then is working with us on something new. And he was similar, where we were able to just sort of have fun with, if I'm doing pencil sketches of levels and you're interpreting those as, again, pixel art of a certain dimension, you know, what more can we get out of that? What can we do? And so with Worse Than Death, we're able to push that even further. Just get like foreground details, more parallax scrolling, cool reflections, just fun background details that look cool no matter what resolution they're at, you know, some lighting effects and extra animation and other sort of tricks. And that was because he was doing that, it freed me up to sort of be a bit more ambitious and have like way cooler backgrounds that did fun stuff.
Right. That's one of the, I mean, there's a lot of, I'd say, less informed into players who look at every pixel game and they assume that it's like trying its best to emulate, you know, a Super Nintendo game or something like that. But
right.
Like, that's one of the really cool things that you can do using the pixel aesthetic. But you know, we have way more resources now. We can, you know, do foreground, background, parallaxing and lighting and stuff. Do you ever feel like, I mean, it is a bit of a balance though. You do kind of want to evoke that retro-y aesthetic. Is there any, do you feel an invisible line, and have you ever like walked towards it, you know, where, you know, if you took one more step it would be a little off the feel?
Yeah, so we have a gigantic rule, which is like, if we're going to do a pixel art game, you can never mix pixel art resolutions on a screen.
Right. Yes.
Absolutely not.
I agree.
Like, it's just, I've played games with friends and we just look at each other in anger because we're just like, no. It's actually fun going back to old games and seeing which ones are able to use like secret high-res modes of old consoles and like between screens. You didn't realize, oh, they're actually switching stuff up, but you don't really notice. But on one screen, no. So there's things like that, including that, you know, like the way Worse Than Death scales its screen to fit certain screen sizes and stuff had to be a certain way, so it didn't sort of like exceed a particular ratio or a particular viewport, so that it wouldn't look off like too high res because it zoomed out a bit too much or whatnot. Right. And that's a lot of just finesse stuff that you can't really put into numbers. You just gotta know. But like you said, it is a feel thing.
Yeah, and making sure scaling stays at even numbers so you don't end up with that like oddly scaled pixel.
Yes. Yeah, we can't. It's like, I didn't have the ability to make pixel interpolation, so we need integer scaling or bust. So so there's some other things too where you know, like Home has no sort of like glowy light effects or things like that. Worse Than Death does. And Alone With You does as well. There's basically tests to make sure that it looked natural and you wouldn't notice, because to me, I was like, oh, I don't like that. Like, I don't like pixel art games that have like a ton of post-processing effects where to me, it just looks garish and tacky. It looks like to me, it looks like early 90s comic book computer coloring, where it's just like throwing everything you can, like as much chrome and gradients and conflicting color matches you can and on a page because you can do it. And a lot of games that do that make me like internally kind of vomit, because that's what I feel. So for me, it's like, oh no, there's like a very specific hierarchy of, if we're going to do like a glow effect or a background effect or whatnot, and a lot of that is just feel. But you know, Worse Than Death has, for instance, like a film grain effect that is always playing. So there's an animated filigrane in the whole game that is like a higher resolution than the actual game, and it actually changes depending on what console you're playing on, because there's certain things that look better on certain kinds of screens. But it's like a high res 1080p a film grade effect that animates at a certain rate, blah 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 blah. But that's all being overlaid over whatever the pixel ratio of the actual game is.
Right. And I mean, you definitely go a lot higher res with the what do we call it? The full screen images, the artwork, the comic book stuff,
right?
The text, the portraits, and that's something actually I've noticed a substantial change game to game in your work is the way that text and the extra scene elements are presented. And I was curious to hear a bit about your process in choosing, the form factor of your text boxes and all that stuff, because I mean a lot goes into that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like anyone who makes games, and especially as you sort of get at it for a while and get good at stuff, you realize how important UI and UX and all that kind of stuff is. And I'm a designer by trade. That's sort of where my wife and I come from the design industry. So it's something I obsess over. Like I'm driving my team nuts right now with stuff on our new game because it's like the mouthfeel of this UI is just not correct. But for home has essentially title cards, like silent movie style title cards. So all text takes over the screen. There's like a border, and then there's a font that's displayed whenever your character is monologuing. And that is also an example of it technically displaying something at a different resolution. Because the text is a higher resolution. It's like a pixel art font that is rendered, but is at a higher resolution than the actual base game. But because it's on the title card, you don't notice, which is kind of the point. Along with you uses a high-res UI, like a 1080p UI that's mostly drawn with vectors and certain other things that animate and do, whatever, over top the like pixel art backgrounds and characters. And I forget what the resolution of that game is, but that was meant to sort of look like old oscilloscopes and whatnot from like 60s and 50s computer technology. And the idea behind that was partly conceptual in that, that kind of felt like the right idea behind the sci-fi nature of this game. It kind of harkened back to some stuff I wanted to mention, but I also knew that we were going to be dealing with a larger amount of UI elements on screen, because there's a text box plus often 3 text choices, like icons that have to go with those text choices, a scanning indicator, a meter that gets filled. Like there's other stuff that can sort of happen. And there were early tests of doing stuff at just pure pixel art at different resolutions. And the idea, sort of what I came to, was like, this just doesn't work. If I'm going to be rendering, PlayStation icons to have choices, then at the size everything has to fit, they'll be incomprehensible. So for that, it was a test to see like, if we do this sort of like vector oscilloscope style UI and everything, does it look congruent or does it look weird? And the answer was, yeah, it looks cool, not the opposite. I was like, great. And because it's always black and white, your brain separates it a bit more from the colorful pixel art background. So unlike it being like pixel art, but a different resolution of pixel art over top of another rendering of pixel art, your brain can separate those two elements and it feels natural. And Worse Than Death is essentially similar. There's a bunch of tests I did with that, again, with pixel art text and other sort of elements, pixel art portraits and whatnot. But I knew I actually wanted to like zoom the screen out a little bit from, say, where home was. Home is like very tight, and Worse Than Death is like, I don't know, 15% farther out, 10% farther out. So it looks a little different. And I knew that instead of having, in the case of home, title cards that took up the whole screen, or in the case of Alone With You, all these other UI elements that had to sort of be there, plus a fair amount of text and these UI choices, I wanted you to really see the portraits for the characters, because that was really important to see the sort of like persona style, like heads that would emote depending on what's going on in the text box and could like shake and animate and stuff like that. Because there weren't dialogue choices in this case, it was text, and I wanted it to be punchy and impactful and whatnot. So in that case, it was, the focus needs to be on these portraits. And then at that point, it's a design problem. What's the aesthetically pleasing ratio of having a portrait on the screen? What's the, in design, we have the correct line width for text for maximum
Right.
readability. So I have all these things sort of built in. Like if that's at a 1080p sort of UI layer, then what are we doing with that? And eventually everything gets put in the way it got put in.
Right. No, it's very interesting to hear about the change in uh, focus depth, or if whatever you want to call it, for
Yeah.
Worse Than Death, because I mean it makes sense when you think about now there's a lot more characters talking to each other on screen. You want to see that like bodily interaction, and the portraits are essential for communication. That's one thing we learned for absolute certain. But what what did you dislike about trying the pixel art portraits? I'm curious because we ended up making the same call, is that to have illustrated portraits for the characters.
It was the question was, seeing these portraits are supposed to give you a higher fidelity look into the characters, so you relate to them and you understand who these little pixel people are on the screen, and can relate to them a bit more emotionally. And it was just a simple question of, if we render them this way, like with say the pixel art test that we did, do we get that? And the answer was like kinda,
Right.
but not enough over just seeing the pixel art portraits that it feels like they matter. So then the test was, if we draw comic book style portraits and put them in, do you? It's like, well, now I understand what these people look like, and I get more of a intense look at like their emotional state, because if they can have a scared version or a sad version or whatever, that makes a bit more sense. And because you see those portraits a lot throughout the screen, especially or throughout the game for Holly and whatnot, then you'll start to relate to her emotions depending on. You're like, oh, you can see she's got her sad face, so she's really bummed out. So it sounds like it's half alchemy and sort of magic, just like playing through it and being like, yeah, this makes sense, but also half sort of planned and saying like, there's a response that we need out of this, and we can A/B test this. We can say, do you get more out of this or this? And the answer was, this works and this doesn't. All right, that's our decision. Let's go with it.
Right. Yeah. It is very difficult to get emotion across with the pixel art faces. That's something that we definitely we tried a little bit of, didn't have a great experience with, and then ended up going for full portraiture, especially because like at the scale of our characters, like almost everybody's face, almost everybody looks identical. It's like hair and accessories that ends up defining the aesthetic of the character. So how much can you really truly get out of that? And it's also cool hearing a bit about your writing formatting, making sure that everything has the maximum width for the readability and all these things. This is something that I've had to deal with since I started consistently, because the engine I use, if it's longer than this, it's just going to cut the text off. Do you ever find that like you edit the way you write to fit these boxes a little bit better?
Absolutely. Like there's mandates that I put in for. I do that for every game, but I've gotten a lot more strict about it over the years for text boxes and dialogue, because one of the examples was like, Alone With You has a lot of text, but it was still heavily edited to say like, okay, for pretty much anything you need, we shouldn't have more than X number of pages of text. That was a bit more difficult because there's a lot of like a bit more lore and stuff. But I think for Worse Than Death, there was a rule. I had a rule that gets broken in a few places, where you should never see more than 3 pages of text for anything.
Mm-hmm.
And much like designing a comic, which is all about pacing, control the pacing of your conversation. So if you're going to have more than 1 page of text, it's because having 1 sentence or say 2 sentences with a pause that the player has to initiate by pressing an A button and then getting the next one is a beat. So that adds a beat to the narrative and a beat to the conversation. So you can pace things out that way to make more interesting and impactful conversations. But I always edit. I always write too much. Of course, all writers do, and then edit down severely.
Right.
I would all the boxes are tested to hold like a maximum number of words, maximum number of lines, whatever, to make sure that things will look right and wrap right and all that stuff. But then it's like, yeah, you never want that. You want like 1 great sentence that people are like, oh shit, and then they press the A button and they're like, oh shit, that's even better.
Right. It's funny. It is a lot like screenplay or script writing. in terms of the way that the characters have to communicate. You can't have a lot of like throwaway dialogue.
Right.
But then at the same time, it has to keep that what do we call it? Curtness. I'll say the shortness, the tightness of it. But then you have all of these like background interactives and like little bits of like lore pieces to find, and so
Yeah.
that just the bulk of writing is immense compared to a movie script. So
Right.
I'm very curious about your total writing process. Do you like start with outlines, or do you go for key scenes first, or do you just like go one to end chronologically? Like how do you do?
Yeah, it's been different for every game. I can so along with you. Let's start there because it's the most complex.
Mm.
That game is at least 100,000 words or something like that. Like it's a wordy game, and there's a lot of lore. So that one was interesting because it was a sci-fi game, and the whole point for those who haven't played it is you're the lone survivor of a colony in space that's essentially about to collapse, and you and this AI need to get off the planet. And to do so, you need to get aid from these 4 holograms who are all based on these important people in the colony before who are now dead and live on in this hologram form. It's basically just an episode of Star Trek. And then through your adventuring missions, as well as meeting these holograms in essentially the holodeck on these sort of romantic little escapades, you get all the story and make choices and affect things as you go along. So with Alone with You and Worse Than Death, the game starts with a theme. So the theme of Alone with You is breakups. And the way it works is that every single story in the game has to meet that theme. So the main plot of the game is literally the planet is breaking up. And then there are like 28 dead bodies essentially you find, like people who were there before, as well as, of course, like you say, all the environmental stuff. So between the 28 people, they all have like little 3-act plays, because each mission or each area essentially goes over 3 weeks. So there's a 3 act, so 1 act per week. And for each week, I can be like, this is all Act 1. So in the Agrodomes, what's Act 1 of the Agrodomes? Well, who's in the Agrodomes? Okay, here's our cast of characters. We've got Leslie, she's the boss. We've got Ashley, who thought she was kind of a shitty boss. We've got these people, and what are their conflicts? And I went through name generators, created characters, and then created personality generators essentially for them, or used personality generators to be like, they're bold, brash, impatient. This other person is submissive, that kind of thing. Found interesting pairings, figured out what their jobs would be based on like, well, if you're working at this like giant space hydroponic place, who would be there? So I would just do research, like who works at a greenhouse, who works at like some kind of crazy grow up somewhere, like all that kind of stuff. And then slot in people into those spots and then be like, okay, where are the conflicts going to be? And if you can, sometimes those things come naturally. We're like, oh, well, this person would maybe, it's kind of like office politics, right? Like you're like, this middle manager is going to have a conflict with this junior person because of whatever. And that's a fun thing you can write. And then wherever it was difficult, I would say like, okay, well, what can we pull out of here? Like maybe somebody, like one of my favorite little hidden storylines is that one person likes another person, but their like love is totally not returned. And there's like a meanness and a sadness to that. That's really fun to find. So you pull out all those sort of things and write that way. So for Alone with You, essentially was like overarching outline. What's the point of this game? Theme. Drill down, take a few bits of that. Then let's write a quick history of the colony because we have to refer to a bunch of history because it's going to be important because everything has happened before you. So what happens? And just make some fun shit up and then check it and make sure it makes sense. And then do the thing that I said where you go through the 3 acts of what's the story of the game and what you're getting out of it. And then every single character's plot, these little 3-act plays essentially are something to do with a breakup of some kind. Again, metaphorical, literal, whatever. And then at that point, I'm writing just scripts. I got all these notes. Along with You, I had like these amazing, just total lunatic notes of just the actual outline per section. And then what happens, the like 3 acts for, like I said, the agrodomes, the caves, the whatever, and then breaking that all down. And then for Worse Than Death, there's also a theme. The theme of the game is secrets. Everything is based on that idea. And so once again, with that, it was figuring out all the little subplots that were going to make this theme all make sense and sort of lift the theme up. that was a little bit different because I wanted to try something different that I also am doing in my comics now, which is that I didn't want to go, not that Alone with You is linear, but I didn't want to make this like gigantic linear plot. I didn't want to spend like X number of months just writing stuff and not getting game stuff done. Because I knew that was a bit of a hole I fell into with Alone with You. It was like just made some things difficult. So I wanted to try a way to make writing and game design and level design and actual production a little bit more simultaneous and a bit more like Marvel method of like, here's the general outline, go make some cool pages, we'll fill in the dialogue later, that kind of thing. So with Worse Than Death, they had the themes, they had a general idea of what was going on. We had locations because the locations were picked because I'm like, this is a cool spot, this is a cool spot, this is a cool spot. So they all have to meet these like, what's a cool location that also allows you to have multiple threads in it, because every good scene in a movie or whatever should have 2 to 3 things going on there, not just like, we're here because we've now found the thing. And, there should also be a, but also, and then, oh no. So it was like, what areas are going to let me get those sort of 3 threads in them that would make sense in the terms of this overall story that I want to write. And then at that point, I totally was pulling like an old school 80s Nintendo where I was like, cool, these are the levels of the game. I'm going to start designing these levels and making sure we come up with good gameplay concepts so I don't get stuck, which is a bad habit of mine, noodling about with little plot details instead of thinking about cool stuff that the player should be doing with their, hands and minds. So there were levels that got shifted around in terms of where they were in the story. Like the library, which is the penultimate level, was the first level built. It was actually the demo that got showed off to like platform holders and whatnot, and was meant to be a lot earlier in the game. And there were certain other things that were sort of shifted around a bit as I realized, like, if we need to have this moment, like we need a reversal or like a reveal, or we need to have a tease, like that makes more sense here because. And I treated it a little bit more like a bunch of Post-it notes on a wall. And that enabled me to have a lot more fun actually while designing it, because I knew that like, I got to have like a monster encounter in this one level, or I got to do something else here, or this puzzle's cool. Yeah, I want to do this puzzle X-rays. That's going to be so fun. And I wasn't so tied into like, but how does it fit into this like elaborate script that like I imagined 6 months ago? So it was a lot more back and forth. And that actually ended up being a lot of fun because I would sort of put things in the level and be like, I'm not sure what we're doing in this one part. Like we have to go to this one part because this is cool, gives me a chance for a jump scare, and it's awesome. But like, what goes on there? And my worry was, well, I'm just going to create these things that make no sense. And when you play, you'll be like, I have no idea what's going on. I found at least that wasn't the case because I would then sort of stop thinking about the specifics and more think about, again, the goals of an area or an emotional journey that a character was on, and then could go, oh yeah, but if we're like in the house, then what if we mention something about someone's dad because that was mentioned there, and we can throw a callback and blah blah blah, and that will all blah blah blah. So it was very nonlinear, and that was a ton of fun to do. Like I love working that way now versus reams of text first.
Right. I mean, it sounds like it's a really healthy way of getting over that narrative adventure game problem of, well, okay, but then what's the game, right? Like,
right, and that's always the case, right? You're always like, great concept, but what do you do?
Right. It is something that I find it can be. A lot of people go into games wanting to tell a story. Like it's a very common thing to have. Yeah, wouldn't this make a really cool game? But the how does it play, and like what is the moment to moment like fun and interaction and thing that makes it a game? It's kind of can fall to the side. So I mean, what was the hardest part you think of going scene with like gameplay sequence and scenes, and then finding the text and narrative pieces sort of afterwards, or bridging them?
There was 2 things. One was that there were some concepts or bits that were just lodged in my brain right from the beginning because they were sort of part of the initial concept, and I was really hung up on them. And some of them I had to essentially like let go because I realized, what am I doing? Like I'm getting so hung up about putting this thing in the game. No one knows that this was supposed to be in here but me. Mm-hmm. And it's just like an albatross at this point. It's not, this is not letting me get this game done and make sort of the most of it. So a lot of it was getting over that and being like, oh, no one's going to notice if I take this out. We'll save that for something else. That's okay. And then allowing yourself to find other better solutions because you're not so hung up on this one that you had in your head. The second part was sometimes just keeping certain continuity things straight, which is something that happens with even the comic I'm working on, the Worse Than Death comic. There's certain things I'm like, did I just screw that up? Like, did I just say we were going to do something and we don't do it? Because you often think back and forth about how just what has to happen for whatever reason. So in some cases, again, I would, blaze through the game while playing it and testing and trying a bunch of gameplay stuff. And of course, not paying attention to the text because I'm like, whatever, wrote this, if it's fine. And then eventually getting at it with fresh eyes or watch someone else play it and be like, oh yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all. Like, that's a giant plot hole. Why would someone be there? So there was one scene, I'm not going to say what it was because just in case someone plays it, I don't want them to be like, oh man, now I see the trick. But there's a part, there were some things when I realized, oh my God, I get so hung up on needing to explain why some people get from point A to point B. And you absolutely do not have to do that.
Right.
Sometimes a throwaway line is all you need. Like, it's to understand, like, we're going from point A to point B, and people are like, okay, cool. So I had to allow myself to have those moments where I'm like, someone says we're going here. It totally makes sense. It doesn't not make sense. Like, why do I have to invent this elaborate concoction?
Right.
It holds up. It holds up. It's totally fine. So a lot of it was like that. Getting rid of. My friend calls it. She makes fun of me for doing comics and stuff because she'll say that I'm like, I just love slow opening scenes. Like, oh, I got to draw the city, and then we have to draw this, and we have to have all this. And she's like, dude, just draw like the front of the restaurant, and people will be like, restaurant, got it, and then move into the scene. You don't need to do all this before you get there. And I had a rule where it's like, no slow openings on anything. You're like bursting onto a scene, and when you're done, you get the hell out.
Right. I mean, that's super important now, especially with attention spans dwindling and shrinking, getting smaller and smaller as you go. And I mean, you're absolutely right. Not everybody who plays your game is going to be a CinemaSin style, like continuity, like focused. Oh no, they couldn't have possibly made it here in time. Yeah, that's good. But I think it also speaks to the fact that it's a thing that you overthink. It speaks to the reality of the game in your own mind, where it's like, well, I'm guilty of similar, where you because you're so invested in everything, you need it to have that like logical consistency in order for I won't put this in your world, but for me, I need it to have that logical consistency, or it feels like I'm making garbage. It feels like I'm pushing fakeness, falseness onto the audience, right? And that can kind of get in the way of telling the best story that we can, because time is resources, and you can't
absolutely
detail.
Yeah, and it's always you got to remember, like the people who are playing a game, like they're looking at everything from the outside in. Mm-hmm. So it's like a user experience kind of thing. They need to understand what is going on, and they need to connect in the way that you want them to connect. And however they do that is whatever works is the correct way. Right. It's like if you design a product and putting a big orange button on it is the right solution for people to understand what that does, that's correct. Even if you never thought you'd ever put an orange button on a product before, that's the right answer.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is one of those things that, like, where utility, it clashes with the artistry of it. Like, there's this piece of me that just like wants to ignore all like consideration for the player and like actualize that reality that like lives in my head. But I mean, at the end of the day, we've got to make games that people like and buy and
right. Yeah, and it's like, so for Worse Than Death, well, all the games are sort of like this, but Worse Than Death specifically has a town map, so like all the locations are mapped out on the town, and there's times on the chapter screens. So the game takes place from a certain period of time till another period of time in the morning, like from 8 till 3. I can't remember what it is now, but so everything was like, well, how what does this level feel like? Is that like an hour and a half of someone's time, even though it's not probably game time? It's like that makes sense. So if we're going from 3 or midnight to 1:30, like does that feel okay? So I have all, and like if you're in the town, could she get from here to here? And if do I just got to bring these things closer together? What's the right way? So there's all those sort of like real things. But the thing is, like, when a writer doesn't do that, but they don't consider any of it, like none of those strings are sort of attached, you feel it and everything feels wrong.
Right, right.
If you go too much, then you're like, oh god, what is going on, or this is laborious, or you're getting hung up on these details that don't matter, or whatnot. But I think the point is to try to get it just right, where it's like it feels like everything is nice and solid, and the internal logic holds true. Even if, like you say, someone could put a YouTube video up and be like, well, actually, I don't.
That guy. Well, I find the best way of hitting that balance is through other people. I find I'm never going to land it properly myself. And so I guess, I mean, we can, I guess, segue into, but like, who are the other people that you work with, and who do you pass your games through in order
Right.
to comprehend them from a non-personal perspective?
Yeah. So obviously the first one is my wife Nancy, because we make all this stuff together, and um, you know, certain games have been more my babies than hers, but everything gets passed through her, of course. And she's like so harsh in the funniest way, where she'll be like, "Yeah, I don't know what that is." It's like there's no argument there. It's
Like
not
on a pixel art.
anything, or like I don't know what this means, or yeah, that doesn't look. They look. Those characters kind of look stupid. Like I don't want to date them. She still has some problems with some of my art and some of my games. She's like, yeah, I would have redrawn that. But she's sort of the editor for all this stuff, because um, I can explain things. Actually, sorry, the reason why it works so well that way is because our personalities are different enough that the what she looks into, or what she gets out of a certain property like this is different enough that she would be like, she's like, yeah, I didn't even notice that there were times on the title screen. Like, I don't care what time you're at the sawmill versus the hospital.
Right.
Um, but she'll say like, I don't understand why these characters yelling at each other. Like, weren't they just friends? Stuff like that. So the stuff that I would absolutely miss because I'm worrying about these little piddly details. Like, oh, did you notice like the skull was shaped like? She's like, what? No, but it's stupid that the skull is here because it should be there. So that it's kind of like we fill in each other's gaps in that way. And similarly, like we'll watch stuff or play other stuff, and we'll both comment on things. And if something feels off, we'll talk about it. Like, oh, what do you think feels weird about it? And she'll be like, oh, I don't know, like the pacing is weird, or like kind of. And the way she explains it will be different. Like I'll be like, oh, well, clearly what they did when they were doing this dolly shot was they didn't focus on the like I'm being an idiot like that. And she's like, I don't know who I'm supposed to care about,
Right.
and I definitely don't care about them. I was like, oh, that's a problem because I think you're pretty much supposed to care about them exclusively. And she's like, yeah, that's stupid. Like I think I know I am, but it doesn't feel that way. And you're like, okay. So that ends up being the best. The one good thing too with like, for instance, working with Nick on the background art for Worse Than Death was, I'm giving him essentially pencil sketches and these layouts that he gets that indicate the rooms where all the exits, or how all the exits work, and the items that'll be animated and stuff that'll be included, with all these notes of like, this is a classroom. This was like a science lab. It should have had water damage and blah 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 blah. And then he'll come back with a lot of stuff and be like, okay, if we're gonna do this, can I add something on like the second floor to be like, well, if there's water damage or something, that's because of X. Like, oh, I didn't think of that. Yeah, because I would have just had like water damage, and then the next floor looks totally clean, and that doesn't make any sense. So all those things have to go through other people because you're always too focused on like one little piece to kind of see the big picture.
Right. That's really, really good. Um, yeah, it is super important to get an exterior perspective on it. The one thing I'm very curious on, because I also have this very similar relationship with my wife, is how do you guys balance that, like, I don't want to call it work-life balance, but like, taking criticism from artistic criticism can be kind of like a deep thing. And especially sometimes even more so
That's
when
deep.
it's somebody you love, right?
Right.
So how do you balance those things?
Well, she's right, and then I just have
Ah.
to listen to it. When she knows, like, what often happens, she'll be like, yeah, his character kind of looks like an idiot because their eyes are all weird and you drew the face wrong. And I'll be like, screw you, it's perfect. And then an hour later, I'll be like, yeah, it doesn't look very good, does it? So sometimes it's just understanding what the process is going to be. Like, I might be like, damn it. But I mean, we're both in the design field and we both come to it, and we both have experience dealing with clients, things like that. So we kind of like client talk to each other. So I'll be like, Nancy, don't tell me why you think it's bad, or like, because that's not helpful because you're not giving me like a solution to fix it. Tell me what it's not doing, and then we can look at it objectively and be like, oh, that makes sense. So she's like, well, like for instance, there's twins in Worse Than Death, and she'd be like, I didn't even know they were twins. I thought they were the same person. Great critique. It's like, because they look too close. Is that the point? Like they're twins, but if you can't tell that they're different people, problem.
Right.
So let's flip the hair. Let's make sure colors are more different on the clothing, or let's change like makeup or something so they just have some other visual cues, like whatever. But if she was like, I don't know, I can't tell the twins. They both look stupid. Like that wouldn't be helpful.
Right.
So thankfully we have that shorthand of being able to think about what's going on. Or she'll say like, well, I really want to be able to do X. And I'll be like, but, if you want to do X, at no point in the game are you ever going to do X again. Like, does that really make sense? Or is it really just that you want to know more about this other thing? Yeah, I want to know more about that thing, not I want to do this specific other thing. Oh, okay. Well, that's a good problem to solve. Let's figure out how to do that. So it's like, all criticism in art direction is basically like a version of couples therapy where you're just trying to get to what the actual problem is,
Right,
in a productive way, and be like, oh, okay, we can do something with that, and then let's try to solve that problem together.
right. I mean, a lot of this sounds like pretty standard good working relationship stuff, even when you're not married.
Right.
I'm curious if there's any aspect of being married that makes anything different for you guys.
I don't know. We've been married for just over 20 years now, so I don't even know what is not being married like
Right.
at this point. But we have all that shorthand. I mean, it makes things easier, right? Because it's like we both know how to push each other's buttons. Like if she really wants to piss me off, she knows what to say, but she doesn't say it. But she can tell me she wants to, and then tell me the actual constructive criticism, and that makes things a lot easier. But similarly, like if I'm like, well, I don't know why you want us to do X in this game, blah blah blah. Like I can think, well, why would she ask for that? Well, it's because she always wants to do X in the game versus this other thing. Does that make sense? If yes, okay, then what do we got to do? So you have that sort of that conceit. But again, that's also a working relationship too. If you have a team or colleagues or whatever, you're going to know all those hidden tricks or things that matter or don't matter to the people you work with. But the one, some of the rules we have are like, if it's quitting time, then we both agree, like, that's it. No more. Or sometimes if she has an idea, because our schedules are often very different, like she's a night person and I'm a morning person. So sometimes it's like, if you have a great idea, write that down and I'll look at it in the morning because I don't want to think about it now.
Right. Yeah, that can be one of that's one of the things that we've had a little bit of a hard time as we've been working together is this is a really interesting thing that I think only couples who work together kind of have, where if you think about the amount of time you actually spend around your spouse for a normal 9 to 5 office couple, right? It's like 4 to 6 hours a day tops, right? Versus, especially if you're a work from home couple that is working together, you're literally like 20 hours a day plus sleeping time. Like it never ends. So like, yes, you've got to define I'm not working now. We don't talk about the work stuff here. You email me if it's really important. But like, what was the process of getting those boundaries for you like? Because it's something that I think we could probably work on a little bit better.
Yeah, I guess it's trial and error too. Um, the one thing was we are so lucky in that because our schedules are different enough. It's like I'm clocking out while she might be wanting to do something else, so we have that separation, which is good. So there's some days where she's like, I just want to go do my thing, and I'm like, that's great because I'm done for the day. Like I don't want to be in the office or whatnot. I'm going to go read or do something else. And it was honestly just, I think it's just realizing over time what's important to you. What are like the things you can't do without? So for me, it's like I need time to work on comics or to read or do things like that during the day. Like I can't not have those during the day. So if the choice is, oh, we're going to talk about this work stuff or do this other batch of work or do that, the answer is always no, because I can't not do that, or I need to go exercise or do whatever. So I think making those priority lists, like shopping for like a house or something, where you're like, well, you know, say you need a wheelchair ramp for your house. That's a non-starter if you go to a place that is absolutely not accessible at all. If there's no way for you to get that. So we sort of just work backwards and be like, what are the things that are just non-starters for a day? And it's like, I'm not working at 8 p.m. if I don't have to, because I will burn out super fast, and we're not going to just spend all day arguing about stuff or weekends or whatnot. Like we have to do that. So it's like that weird, it's like a contract negotiation long term.
Right.
And once you realize what each other's sort of like must-haves are or must not haves, it becomes harder to sort of argue against someone or to be like, well, I want this, because you realize like they're not going to budge on that. That's not the right way to put it. You realize this is extremely important to them. And if this was a non-work situation and your spouse was like, well, this is very important to me. Right. If you're a good partner, you wouldn't be like, well, F that then. I don't give a shit about that. You would say like, okay, if this is that important, we'll find a way to make it work.
Right. And I think there's a lot to be said about having those necessities, we'll call them, personal necessities satisfied, that enables people to do their best work. When if you're the type of person that needs an hour a day to go exercise, or you need that time to sit and read in order to be the best creative you are, then I think all things should kind of gear towards facilitating that. So it's kind of an easy compromise, I think. No, so I guess I'm curious also about the change in the company name. I mean, if it has been Benjamin Rivers Inc. for almost 10 years. What spurred the change, and what does the change actually mean in terms of how anything changes?
Right. So we've been wanting to do it for quite a while. Basically, it was about a year process to get to this. So we rebranded this summer as BancyCo as opposed to Rivers Inc. Technically, this the same thing. It's just a name addition. If you want to get real hardcore about the legalese about it,
right?
But a lot of it was just that, like with a lot of good changes, it's not that you think about the change and be like, we should do this, but you just realize that the longer you don't do it, there are more negatives and positives. So a lot of that is that we have been working with other people for a lot longer. In the beginning, it was Benjamin Rivers Inc. because essentially I was just freelancing and needed to incorporate, and then I don't know what was going to happen. So it just was like, that sounds like a great name because I can use it for freelance.
I've used it my whole life.
And then games happened, and I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to do this, and then it kind of stuck. But as Nancy was more involved, of course, and as again we're working with other artists and other people, we would just notice perception was not what we wanted it to be. So as an example, I've had people being like, so like, do you make games full time? I'm like, yeah, like for almost 10 years. What gave you the, I'm not sure what gave you the perception that I was like just doing this on weekends. So there's like this little like in like brand discovery stuff. It's like, well, what is the brand doing and not doing? You have all those like conversations. It's like, well, sometimes we do hear that people think it's just me noodling around. Like, well, you definitely don't want that because it's definitely not that. Right. Is that important? Yes, it is, because, we're talking to publishers or talking to other people, and there's a perception there. And also just sometimes it's just annoying to have to explain it over and over again. Mm-hmm. Nancy always joked that she's like, I just don't want a business card that just has your face on it. Like,
Right.
Like, it can't just be you. That's weird. So the kind of like with many decisions in life, like it's never a major turning point. It's just a bunch of things that add up, and then you go, "Oh, I think we're just inevitably going to turn this way."
Right. Right. Right.
So again, it was last year that we decided, like, okay, yeah, let's do it. Let's rebrand the company and let's go through the process. We went through discovery phase and came up with like all these names and thought about stuff and what we're trying to do and what it was. And like most things, it's sort of like we went really far out into left field and then kind of came back a lot closer than we imagined we were going to in terms of look and feel and what was going on. And then settled on BancyCo. And once we did, like we literally were like, we need to find a fucking name for this company because I'm so sick of thinking about this. We had like our list and we'd done all these tests and blah blah blah. And I was like, let's just use the name everyone calls us because people that was like our celebrity couple name. I was like, just BancyCo. And she's like, really? I'm like, yeah, I like it. It's great. I'm like, let me just mock some stuff up for you. And we sort of did it. I was like, trust me, this is great. And she's like, well, I can't think of a reason to not like it. I'm like, perfect. That's approved. Stamp. So we kind of just went with that.
Right. Yeah. Now, I mean, now that you mention all of the little reasons why, I mean, a lot of people would never think that having a growing company with the founder name as the company name eventually does become, I mean, an issue in some regards, right? Like, it feeds into that, you know, solo auteur, you know, myth. I mean, very few, right? It's a huge problem in the industry where a lot of people end up believing, you know, this game was made by this one person and they didn't have anybody help and they did it all by themselves. And now I'm going to go out and try and do the same thing. And what happened to my life? It's ruined. Oh no. And also, I mean, like, it'd be very hard to get to that point where, okay, you guys can handle 2 projects at a time now. One of them, which you are not leading, you know, to grow in that regards, it would be very, very difficult. So the change makes a little more sense to me now that I hear it from that perspective. Very interesting. Have you noticed any big? Has the announcement or it changed anything fundamentally, you know, in terms of how the public's received it, or you know, dealing with anybody yet? Have you noticed the results?
So far, no. A lot of that though is just that, you know, people generally aren't going to pay, like, you know, players and stuff are not really going to pay too much attention until there's a new game to play, you know. Right. So the biggest thing will be the day we get to launch a trailer showing off a new game with a new logo and identity, and then get to throw the little tag that says like formerly Benjamin Rivers Inc. or whatever. So some people will be like, oh. And you know, there'll be some crossover confusion of some people being like, but I thought those other people made Home, or that other guy, or, you know, whatever. But right now people are like, cool, and most people don't know. There is a huge benefit that I've finally realized over the years that Nancy always helps me, when you realize most people don't even know what the hell's going on, like, you know, 2 inches past their face. So you can kind of get away with a lot. It's kind of like when you're worried, like, oh my God, the shirt has a stain on it, and you're like, man, people, they don't even notice anyone that's not them. They're not going to notice you and your shirt.
Right.
You could walk naked down the street, probably. Most people wouldn't even stop to look.
Right. It's most players barely know where their games come from.
Right.
It's a very small factor.
And part of the reason why we did the branding the way we did, which is that there is a clear evolution between what the Benjamin Rivers Inc. brand looked like and the way BancyCo looks, where there's 2 of our faces. The colors are similar. Like, there's a certain sort of overall appearance to that. Like, that's on purpose, because you can throw up the new logo or something new on one of our old products and it will emotionally feel generally the same from what most people have seen, which is okay. It's not like it looks like it's suddenly been taken over by somebody completely different.
Right on. Wow. Yeah. Okay. That's a pretty good explanation for it all, and I'm very, very. I was very curious, and then, I mean, now it all makes beautiful sense.
Excellent.
I guess as we get to the wind down here, I've seen you have a Twitch channel.
Yes.
This is something I do want to ask a little bit about. How long have you been on the Twitch, and I guess why and how did you start?
I started, the first time I sort of started was in 2019. I actually can't remember what month it was or whatnot. And a lot of it was just wanting to play games with other people and realizing that a lot of people were not available when I wanted to play games with them.
Right.
And I love retro games, and at that point I was like collecting a bunch of stuff and kind of just like starting to rediscover a bunch of stuff, or just dig through old console or content on old consoles that I'd like, oh, I finally want to go try out these games that I hadn't tried before. And I'm the kind of person who loves playing games with other people, not like multiplayer games, single player games. It's kind of like I love watching bad movies with other people so we can just enjoy it together, all that kind of stuff. And I love playing games and talking about them, and dissecting them and thinking about them and all that stuff. So essentially Twitch was a version to do that. I don't remember what happened in the before times when I first started. There was the thing that happened, and then there was a lull. I honestly can't remember. I'm assuming it was just something work that sort of like kind of just railroaded it for a little bit. And then what happened was in January 2020, I was like, yeah, pretty sure based on all the rumblings, I'm gonna be home a lot, and this winter sure feels like it's gonna be long. Right. So on January 1st, 2020, I was like restarting the channel. So like we updated the branding, did all the setup, and made sure everything was good to go. And then on New Year's Day, 2020, first stream. And I follow a bunch of other people on Twitch, like other Canadian streamers and stuff, who sort of had some audiences. And there's a bunch of people who essentially crossed over, and we sort of share what we call the stream fam now. And I've been basically doing it ever since January 2020. Originally, it was twice a week. And then as sort of, especially all through 2020, why the hell go anywhere that year, right? So, and then essentially this year, as spring got around and as sort of like vaccines and stuff were happening, I was like, I think I need to go outside just a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And Nancy would like our date night back on Fridays. So I was like, okay, I'm going to drop it to 1 day a week for now, just while the weather's nice. Because it was like a long, dark period of just being inside. And I would like to just get out a little bit more. Who knows what will happen this winter if I go back to 2 days a week again. But essentially, I've kept the schedule up as best I can. It's pretty good. There's been a couple, misses here and there, but it's pretty consistent. And like I bought a whole bunch of retro stuff, and then I started getting EverDrives, and I was just going a little ape shit there for a little while. But I kind of have played through the majority of sort of stuff from like the mostly 8 and 60-bit and some 32-bit stuff that I've kind of like always wanted to play that was just kind of out of reach before. And a lot of that was like, oh, let's go finally play this, like Kudelka on PS1 is my favorite example. Let's go play this weird shit, like half Japanese, half Welsh horror gothic turn-based RPG on PS1 because I've heard cool things about it, and it ends up being like one of my favorite games of all time. Right. But it's way more fun with other people who are like, oh yeah, and they're like looking up trivia, and everyone's invested, and we're picking stuff apart, and we're all getting into it. And because I'm a game developer, one of the conceits is like, I can't just not play it, talk about it, and be like, oh, what are they doing here? And like, oh my god, like check, like in the case of Kudelka, like they had mocap studios. This is literally the first mocap game that I know of where they had all the cast members recording on a soundstage all at once, one take, on the scene, mocap data, fixed camera, record cutscene, go. And there's all this sort of like cool technical stuff, artistic stuff, and sort of paying attention to things and being like, oh my god, all this time I thought this game was doing X, and like I'm pretty sure they're just like fudging it with whatever. Holy crap. And that just makes it more fun, because then I'm like, well, hold on. If like effing Super Mario can do whatever and get away with it, like I'm not fixing that thing in my game. That's totally fine.
Right. Yeah, that's sounds like a lot of fun for Twitch. I've used it almost exclusively with development streams, which is something I mean, not a lot of developers are keen on doing and revealing the process and all that. Have you ever tried streaming development or considered it?
I have considered it for sure. I've done some deep dive streams for, I can't remember, I think for Worse Than Death stuff, where I basically like loaded up the project file and explained stuff and went through things. I've also done art streams, and sometimes I do those on Instagram as well, where it's like I'm inking the book or penciling stuff and going through process like that. I've always wanted to do more development streams. The problem is I don't think my brain is compatible with that, because I can draw and explain something, which is difficult feel like it's like flying a plane and narrating what you're doing to somebody else. Like it's extremely hard. But like thinking through, say, a code for like as much as I can call myself a coder, or design stuff is a lot harder.
Yeah.
It's like just the conflicting. I think it's like the same part of my brain is being asked to multitask, and it doesn't work out.
Right. Yeah. No, I feel you.
So I can definitely do things afterwards, like, okay, check this cool thing that I did this week, and like why I think this is going to be cool.
Right.
But I don't think I can do it at the same time. And also, I'm just like all over the place.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't make good content. It doesn't. It's not engaging. A lot of it's me staring at the code and
Just swearing.
Yeah. Like what the fuck. But that's that. My dude. I mean, great to hear. I mean, is there anywhere you want the people to follow you in BancyCo, and anything that you want to draw their attention to before we dip and get out of here?
Yeah, I mean, you can follow us at on the internets at bancy.co, and you can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at BancyCo. But primary Twitter presence would be me, which is Benjamin Rivers, and that's sort of like where I'm at the most. And if you want to see my comics, see the Worse Than Death sequel comic, see those pages as they go up and all the sketches and stuff about what I'm doing there, you can follow me on Instagram at Benjamin Rivers Inc. And Twitch is the same thing, Benjamin Rivers Inc.
Very good. Well, my dude, thank you so much for coming on and talking all about the games and the goods. Yeah, I guess we'll snap out of here for now. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Goodbye, everybody. I don't know where we're gonna raid, but we'll see you somewhere. Goodbye.